Well, good afternoon to all of those in the UK, and good evening to those joining us in Japan, and a warm welcome to this second Japan Macro Salon for 2024, run jointly, as always, between the Japan Society of the UK and Asia Society Tokyo. I am Bill Emmett, and I have the honor of chairing the Japan Society. Thank you to all of you for your support for the Society and for these events. Joining me, as always, is our old friend Jesper Koll, longtime Japan resident and who has been chief economist and strategist for such top investment houses as JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch. Jesper is a board director now for Monex Group and for the Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology, and is one of the few non-Japanese members of Keizai Doyukai. Most notably, of course, he is a fully paid-up Japan Optimist, but nowadays is not as lonely in that role as he once was. Our special guest today will be Professor Yoko Iwama, who is director of the Strategic Studies program at GRIPS, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. She's a specialist on international security, and so we thought she would be the ideal person to review Prime Minister Kishida's visit to the United States last week, and, of course, the associated trilateral summit there between the US and the Philippines and Japan, as well, of course, as the knotty issue of Nippon Steel's proposed purchase of US steel. Jesper and I will start with the latest economic issues and then move swiftly to the political and international backdrop afterwards, bringing in Iwama-sensei for the rest of our conversation. Please do submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and feel free to vote for other people's questions to bring them more quickly to my attention. But Jesper, lovely to see you again. 3 months have gone past. We've had a so-called historic decision from the Bank of Japan in that period, a radical move in interest rates from minus 0.1 to plus 0.1. But meanwhile, what's been going on in the economy from your point of view?
So it's very interesting, Bill, that the things that we've learned are all very positive and suggests that the business cycle upswing in Japan is actually going to be strengthening from here on. And most importantly is the fact that business investment expenditure, CapEx, according to all the surveys that we have for the new fiscal year that started in April, business investment expenditure is likely to grow by another 8 to 10%. And this comes on top of 2 consecutive years already of double-digit growth. And that's very, very important because, the consumer in Japan is always going to be fickle. There's always going to be ups and downs. But really, if you measure the business cycle, you really focus on capital investment expenditure. And what's exciting here is that this cycle of reinvesting in domestic productive capacity, as well as capital deepening, so putting better machinery, better software, better robots, into your facilities, that this investment back into the domestic economy by Japanese top companies, as well as small and medium-sized companies, is actually very broad-based. So it's not just the car companies or the base materials companies, but it is actually the service companies as well, where you do see continued, animal spirits reinvesting here in Japan. And that suggests that, for 2024-25, for the fiscal year that just started, that indeed the economy can very well grow above expectations, which would be around 2.5%. So on top of business investment, what we also learned, and which was key ultimately for the Bank of Japan decision, is the reality that, yes, thank you, the lagging indicator of the business cycle, which is the labor market, is actually starting to accelerate very, very fast. And you all know by now that the shunto, that the base pace negotiations basically came in at just a touch above 5%. This is after 3.6% last year, and over the previous decade, an average of around 1.5%. And this is very, very important. You actually do see that, of course, lagging all the other indicators in the economy, that the labor market is very tight, that finally that tightness in the labor market is actually yielding price power for Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe. And I want to add something to this. We did some work with Recruit, which is, as you know, Japan's biggest recruiting and labor agency, private company on that. And we found that of the top 500 companies, now for the first time ever, they all hire more people mid-career than they hire at the graduate intake. Which is very interesting that over the last decade, it was about 15% mid-career hiring, and the rest was all new graduate hirings, right? So that, in other words, some of the indications that labor market mobility, that you've got the Japanese in their late 20s and 30s, actually beginning to switch jobs, right? That liquidity in the labor market, which has long been a big issue of discussion, is actually starting to happen. And Bill, what's very interesting, apparently on the Recruit data, if your price increase, if you offer a 12 to 15% better wage packet, right, then Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe in their late 20s and 30s are actually prepared to move. So it's quite interesting, that we are looking at a Japanese economy where the capital formation within the domestic economy is continuing to pick up, and where human capital is also getting, number one, a higher price, right, with the shunto, and on top of that, that the elasticity of wage increases actually are leading to an increase in liquidity in the Japanese labor market. And all of that makes me very bullish, and does suggest, as I mentioned, that the Japanese economy in 24-25 could easily run at 2.5%, rather than the sort of 1.25% that the consensus is expecting.
Well, that's quite a radical difference, I must say. I mean, it would particularly depend, I would say, on the consumer sector kind of reinforcing the business investment, which really depends. I mean, last year you had real wages falling on an aggregate basis because inflation was unexpectedly high and just topped out above wage rates. This year, then you're expecting real wages to be rising. Consumer confidence indicators certainly support some of what you've been saying. I've seen. I also saw a commentary looking at service price inflation, which was, I thought, an interesting point to look at, because if you're going to see domestically generated like in inflation, then it would be in the services sector rather than the imported inflation through goods, and that was coming through, I suppose, in the wages that are being have to be paid, especially. And are you seeing it broadening out to SMEs? I mean, the long question has been, does the shunto then reach into the bedrock of SMEs?
So, I mean, the verdict is still out. We only know in terms of the data, by June, July, on, how much trickle through, as it were. But what is interesting, Bill, is that here our friends in the Japanese technocracy, in the Japanese elite bureaucracy, are actually putting enormous amounts of pressure on Japan's big companies to allow the shitaoke, right, the subcontractors and contractors, to allow those companies, which are small and medium-sized companies, to actually raise their prices. Wow. Which is very interesting. So that, in other words, you've now got Gyosei Shido, so you do have administrative guidance that say, hey, Nissan, hey, Toyota is in a big focus, right? Hey, Toyota, you are not forcing your suppliers in the traditional way, which is what you always do when there is cost push inflation. You try and have your suppliers take on the burden. They are actually now being encouraged by the government to encourage their suppliers to actually raise prices, which means that then the suppliers do have room to actually increase wages as well. So it's quite interesting, that you actually have sort of I'm going to say one team, one dream, that you've got, yes, the demand supply in the labor market, obviously pointing in the direction of increases. But on top of that, you've got the rule makers and regulators and overseers also putting pressure to ensure that this time it's not just the big guys, but that it's the belly of the beast, that it is the small and medium-sized companies that are following through.
Well, that would be very interesting if it comes through. And let me take you back for a moment back to that mid-career job changing data, which I thought was fascinating. I mean, you're saying that the research suggests that it's basically a 12 to 15% premium is what's required. I must look to see what, as it were, how that compares with where evidence in other economies actually. So what does that tell you about like the obstacles, but also, I mean, that 12 to 15% sounds like it's doable actually in this environment. I mean, that's the question. And how new is it, and how extensive is it?
Bill, you again, I mean, it's all new
Yeah.
in the sense of that, that obviously it's completely sensible and pragmatic to look at COVID, as sort of a big catalyst for a lot of the changes in behavior within corporate cultures within the firms, right?
Yes.
Also, this gets compounded, by the reality of all corporate leaders now sweating. Because last year, as you all know very well, the Tokyo Stock Exchange did put this price to book above 1. If it's not above 1, what are you doing? What is your growth strategy? How do you justify having lazy balance sheets and not a forward-looking focus? So everybody right now is working overtime to come up with these new strategies that are going to be presented at the AMGs, at the general shareholder meetings, in June, July. So it's quite interesting, this corporate metabolism. Lazy CEOs are just no longer accepted. Everybody is now working, and ICE actually starting to take action, which you see. Again, M&A activity, MBO activity, IPO activity, business investment expenditure, human investment. So there is a spring in the step of Japan that certainly I haven't seen, in over 20 years. And this is important because in the past, everything was led by a crisis management. There was a crisis, and therefore Prime Minister Abe gets Mr. Kuroda to do a bazooka to do something, because there was a serious risk of the economy falling into a deflationary spiral. Now, the government actually is not a superstar. There are no bazookas. For all intents and purposes, Prime Minister Kishida is just doing nothing. And for all intents and purposes, even the Bank of Japan, for all intents and purposes, is normalizing monetary policy, but is certainly not bringing out any bazooka. In fact, is down speaking and messaging as much as possible that, look, all we're doing is we are reliquefying fixed income market. We are not looking to step on the brakes. So it's quite interesting, that this time it's not macro policy led, but it really is bottoms up led, with the CEOs, with corporate leaders for various reasons, right? All bringing back the animal spirits, getting rid of lazy balance sheets, investing in the future of the business via M&A and via business investment expenditure, as well as via human capital.
And what are the implications then for the Bank of Japan's monetary policy?
So it is very interesting. I've been having lots of arguments. So I actually am going to step out of a box now. I actually think that the Bank of Japan is at risk of running behind the curve, of actually doing too little too late. Very interesting. You obviously have, after basically more than 20 years of de facto zero interest rates, right? You have a very cautious approach, which is the pragmatic thing to do. And I mean, who am I to argue with Professor Dr. Governor Ueda? He's the smartest man in the room, even when Dr. Larry Summers is in the room, right? But, all joking aside, it's obviously the right thing, to start out cautiously. But I think that the reaction that we've seen in debt and in equity capital markets, obviously suggests that there's a high degree of confidence, that indeed, this normalization can happen smoothly. You see the fact that basically the yield curve for the fixed income markets basically, has not really moved very much. There's been some gyrations with upward pressure there. But the bottom line is, Bill, I'm becoming more and more worried about inflation. And your finger on the pulse here. You've got now service sector inflation, where obviously the inbound tourism boom, and as you know, basically we're back above where we were in terms of inbound tourism before the COVID pandemic. They keep on pouring in. And as a result of that, in the domestic service sector, you actually start to see, significant inflation actually coming through. And Bill, the interesting thing is it's very difficult to see what's going to stop that. What's going to stop that, from continuing to accelerate? So more and more business leaders have confidence that price increases actually stick. The government is encouraging even the small and medium-sized companies in the supply chain to increase their prices. So you really do have a concerted effort that probably means that inflation is going to surprise on the upside rather than on the downside. And as a result of that, the Bank of Japan may very well, over the next 4 to 6 months, become more aggressive relative to what the expectations are right now. To give you a number, I think that by the time Germany wins the World Cup, no, I think that policy rates being at around 2% by the end of 2025 is a very, very reasonable forecast.
Now, in principle, both psychologically and probably in gaming the market, the lagging behind would seem to me absolutely the understandable, but also probably the appropriate thing to do, given the decades worth of low inflation expectations that the Bank of Japan has been contending with. What, if you think you're worrying about inflation surprising on the upside, does that bring new risks that you think that you would like to mention to us? That in the bond market or elsewhere, or is it really a macro management question that's more technical?
So, Bill, it's very interesting because at the end of the day, the most free market in Japan is the exchange rate.
Yes.
And, the yen is weak, and you can always put the finger on expectations in the US having gone from easing to stable to low for long or high for long. There's obviously something has changed over the last 6 weeks in particular in the United States in terms of interest rate expectations. But it is not wrong when you look at the Japanese data to point out that, the continued weakness of the Japanese yen is also a sign, right, of, it's a big word and you want to be careful using it, of capital flight. You do actually see, the fact that real interest rates in Japan are by far the lowest in the world. They're still negative. If I'm halfway right and CPI inflation in 4 or 5 months is going to be 50 basis points higher than it is today, that means that, yes, the Bank of Japan is indeed behind the curve there. And as a result of that, I think, watch the exchange rate. And I've been having lots of discussions with some macro speculators. And several of them are now looking for dollar yen to go all the way to 200, 220.
Wow.
Which is, again, the dynamics that we've seen unfold over the last 2 years. Has anything significantly changed, i.e. a US economy stronger than expected, right?
Yes.
The Federal Reserve increasing interest rates, while Japan is doing what Japan always does, which means they are ending up being too cautious, for too long.
Yes. Wow. Well, that's a perspective. Now, before bringing in Iwama Sensei, bringing in Yoko Iwama, I'm just going to quickly raise 2 questions because I think they won't be so appropriate later, which are more or less the same question that have come in, both of them about the labor market, bringing you back to that, and about gender diversity. One, is it increasing with these changes? And Paul Diamond, who's a longtime Japan Society member, asks, are larger companies being proactive in recruiting and promoting female employees through to more senior roles? What's your snapshot of that issue?
No, Paul, fantastic. And you are seeing, and I'm speaking now from some of the work and that my wife Kathy Matsui has been doing, and she's, as you know, monitoring this very, very carefully. You find empirically more and more companies actually adopting de facto quotas. So that, at the intake level, that a minimum of 30%, and many companies actually striving for balance for 50% of female intake. So it's very, very interesting that, in terms of the actual application and the actual orders going out to the Jinjibu, to the HR departments, that the balance has shifted, that now you've got, more, dare I say, Western style empowerment strategies, right? With outright quotas actually starting to come through.
And will that be because of shortages or because of employee motivation, or what is driving those companies to do that in your and Kathy's view?
I think number one, it is the reality is like, look, we're just running out of labor, and it just doesn't make any sense anymore. My favorite example obviously is Japan Airlines, which has just promoted, a 59-year-old stewardess who started as a stewardess. And this is, by all accounts, I haven't met her, but I've got some friends who know her. She is not a trophy CEO, right? She is actually a hard-nosed, top-level CEO who could easily pick a fight with Jamie Dimon. So it's quite interesting that you've got these success stories at very high-profile companies, where females are now moving into the C-suite, or even into outright presidency and CEO level. So you're going to get more role models, which I think is going to create a virtuous cycle here in Japan.
Brilliant. I think that I absolutely agree with that. Now, Yoko Iwama, turn on your video, please. Welcome to the Japan Society. Talking of role models, Professor Iwama was Jesper Koll's role model at Kyodai back in the 1980s. And again, welcome to joining us today. Thank you very much for sparing the time in the middle of your evening. America and Japan, first of all. Prime Minister Kishida, glamorous state dinner. Miki Mikitani dressed in traditional gear. Paul Simon playing after dinner. What could be better? What's your assessment of the US-Japan relations and how it matters?
Yes, it was a very nice visit. Everybody seems to be happy. And it was the first state visit since Prime Minister Abe was there 9 years ago. In many ways, I find it really interesting how this government is kind of rounding up, wrapping up, and reaping the fruits of all the changes and reforms that started in Abe period. I mean, Jesper just mentioned economy, and this whole thing started with Abe-san very courageously starting a very unconventional policy. And what happened in Washington and all these statements, that was a kind of a logical conclusion of all the changes that had started ever since the first Abe administration. So I'm not sure if Kishida-san is consciously doing it, but he's kind of playing the last sort of curtain call of the Abe drama.
And he even seemed to be handing out advice to the United States about, yes, you need to be a superpower. Yes, you need to support Ukraine. Yes, you need to be a proper global leader, and we will be by your side. It's quite unusual we are used to Larry Summers coming to Japan to give lectures, but I mean, have Kishida Fumio go to America to give lectures. Now that's a new thing.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if he thought he was giving lectures, but I find it very appropriate. Today we have a Brit, a Japanese, and a German here lined up, all kind of the best friends of the US. And we're all trying to somehow support the Americans that they can keep on playing the role that they've been playing for the past 70 years or so. But then are we really on the same page? I mean, that was the message, right? The global partnership.
Yeah.
And he mentioned NATO and all these AUKUS and everything. And he was kind of stressing how we were now networked and global, free and open society. Yeah, but as I said before this started, Chancellor Scholz is currently in China. And yeah, so are we really on the same page? I think there's still a lot of work to do, but it was good that Japan and US is kind of moving forward, and that we have the Philippines on our side, which was not the case, several years ago in the previous government. So, well, things are moving, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
And what's your, maybe I'll bring Jesper in as well. I mean, obviously the mentioning of Chancellor Scholz going to China, I would say that's the reason for concern about that is because so much of the discussion has been about economic security in recent years, harmonizing economic security approaches, technology approaches to China, but also seeming to work together in our mutual economic security, reducing dependencies, and preventing, as it were, aiding a potential adversary. And then Nippon Steel seek to buy US Steel in an auction started by US Steel, put itself up for sale. Nippon Steel were the highest bidder, and suddenly a lot of Americans, particularly Republican Americans, but now also President Biden, suggest that this should be stopped, and that somehow Japanese ownership of a steel company is a threat to American national security. How does this play into this happy picture that we've been witnessing?
You're asking me?
I'm asking you, and then Jesper might comment on that. Obviously, it's an election year. We know that.
We were just talking about this over lunch today with some journalists, and I was asking why some newspapers are not speaking out more strongly for the rules of free economy. And the answer was it's an election year. So
Yes.
I think it's the politeness of Japanese people that's keeping them from speaking out against the behaviors of current government. I mean, yeah, but I think there's even criticism inside the US. And I'm sure off the camera backstage, this was probably one of the topics that they spoke about. But it's election year. What do you say, Jesper?
What do you say, Jesper? Is it, I mean, if we want a 12 to 15% pay premium for Japanese people to change jobs, what's the premium the United Steelworkers need to accept a Japanese owner? Is that the price that we're discussing?
No, but look, I think, I mean, there's obviously optics, there's narratives, I mean, you probably know this, Bill. I mean, there's exactly 20,000 steel workers in America left, which is 1/3 of the number of people who are manicures, for example, right? So, I mean, in terms of, it's obviously highly political, et cetera, et cetera. But, I think Nippon Steel is actually playing its cards very well. In the sense of that they have, made very clear statements now that they will move their U.S. headquarters, to Pittsburgh, that they will basically do what Japanese companies do, which is actually retrain the workforce and basically create an environment that rewards productivity. And I think that, all this grandstanding, in the sort of 19th century black and white movie election campaign thing that America is doing, I think when the chips are down, I think that even Mr. Trump, will agree, to the deal actually going through. Because at the end of the day, it's not just the technology transfer, it's not just the financial transfer, but for the US-Japan alliance and for the US-Japan partnership, right? Having this joint production base on both sides of the Pacific just makes so much sense, because if you do want to service, a fleet that is across the Pacific, then yes, having a unified steel company that basically does the heavy lifting makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. And do you, I think not a directly related question, Yoko, but there was discussion at the summit or around the summit about Japan being a potential future part of AUKUS, with the UK and the United States, and Australia. UK, United States, and Australia. Of course, part of that is a shipbuilding program, but that's not so much the question of steel, but a lot of that to do with technology. Do you think that's plausible that we could be talking about JAUKUS within a reasonable period of time? Is that a practical further development for Japan's strategy?
I think from Japan's point of view, it's quite reasonable and practical. Partly up to UK. I can't really think Australians would be against it. But AUKUS so far has been so much about nuclear-powered submarines. So the so-called Pillar 2 haven't really, we really don't know what it's going to be about. But I think, the submarines, they're not going to be there for a long time. And there's a lot of things we should be doing together in the meantime. So I think it totally makes strategic sense for Japan to be part of AUKUS. There's been also talks about Japan joining Five Eyes for quite a while. And I'm personally rather skeptical about that because it's so much about information. And then these 5 countries are kind of bound together by family tradition. But I think AUKUS means more pragmatic business, and therefore I can very well imagine Japan's place in that.
Yes, Five Eyes, as you say, is it's a long-standing Anglophone network of intelligence sharing between all of these former Anglophone, well, presently Anglophone friends, whereas which does raise questions about like, particularly at the moment, about Japan's intelligence system, about the security clearance process and so forth. But maybe it will take longer to clear those. Whereas AUKUS, while you're not going to be buying nuclear-powered submarines, I don't think, maybe Japanese membership of AUKUS would help to broaden the focus of the arrangement beyond the headline grabber, which is the submarines, which is becoming quite controversial in the United States.
I think so. And well, they were also considering Japanese submarines, and it was a pity that they didn't take it up. But
Yes.
I think, Australia and Japan are really natural partners. And with Philippines now very securely on our side, I think there's a lot that can be done. Of course, Indonesia is always a concern for the Australians. But I think our relationship, Japan-Australia relationship has really gone through a tremendous change these 5-10 years. And now the Australian embassy here in Tokyo has, I think, the second biggest group of attaches in the world, probably.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Let's
Huge.
Yes, right. I didn't know that. Yeah, no. Yeah, they always used to be just iron ore traders in the past, weren't they? I mean, shipping that up to Nippon Steel, basically bringing us back to that. But so let's talk a little bit about the Philippines and Japan. I can see that you're negotiating reciprocal access agreements for Japanese forces to be able to use Philippine facilities. Now that is quite interesting. The general kind of assumption about Japanese forces is that they can't go very far. That the constitutional constraints would make them not so able to use faraway islands. But what's the purpose of this arrangement in your assessment?
Well, we have to see that, but I mean, the JSDF has been going out quite a lot recently, especially since this Indo-Pacific strategy. So again, this is kind of a full circle of what Abe had started. What I thought was very interesting in the joint statement was also the economic security side and how semiconductor came into this, and to train younger Filipinos to work in the industry. Because Japan is going to suffer from a huge demographic change. I mean, that's one of the dark sides of the bright future of Japan that you spoke about, Jesper. It was interesting. I mean, I was reading the speech from Prime Minister Abe 9 years ago, and there were a lot of things he talked about. One of the two things he said, and he was determined to do, one was womenomics, and the other was demography. And I think, well, if we trust Jesper, things are changing on women's side. But on demography, it's been very, there's really nothing to see. The birth rate has been going down continuously, and it's nosediving. If you look at what's happening in Korea, and I think we're following Korean numbers. So, I mean, it's obvious from demography that we're going to need a lot of people from Southeast Asia to help us here in Japan. And obviously, Philippine is one of the best source that we can address for solving this problem because of the proximity, because of the political and cultural relationship that we've had.
Very interesting. So do you think, Jesper, that you'll see in Kumamoto, we'll be hearing Tagalog spoken quite a lot among the technicians working?
You already do, but Yoko makes the important point. That, I mean, the visit that we had, there was all this wonderful party, blah blah blah, which is nice. But more in substance. I mean, think about it. Just at the beginning of the we had the trilateral with South Korea, very, very important, right? And obviously the relationship with South Korea is not going to be about human exchange, because basically, you've got a similar sort of demographic time bomb, that is ticking in South Korea. So South Korea, that trilateral, Japan, South Korea, America, very, very much for the strategic alliance, right? And now, you've had the Philippines come in. And again, all the newspapers talk about, all the military stuff, because that's what people want to talk about right now. But actually, the relationship is much, much deeper, much, much denser, and reaffirming that you've got the human exchange, the civil exchange, and the training part, with the Philippines actually deepening out. And I'm going to make a forecast. I think that next on the agenda is going to be a trilateral with Indonesia. Because obviously, Japan has a very close relationship with Indonesia. lots of economic integration. And, you know, it's obviously of huge strategic importance also for the United States of America. So I think that, you know, if Kishida, you know, can pull that one off, right, then I think you've got a real new network building and density of relationship building, you know, where Japan plays a leading role, but it is in partnership with the United States to actually make sure that Japan, South Korea, Japan, Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, you know, actually get integrated more closely.
I think that's fascinating, and I completely agree with that. I mean, what do you think, Yoko? I mean, Japan really is much more able to speak in a close and serious way with Indonesia than the United States could. The new president, Prabowo, will be is quite an unpredictable fellow, but nevertheless, he, shall we say, but he is and Indonesia has a strong ties to China as well. But how
Yeah,
do you see Japan,
exactly.
Indonesia being able to develop economically and politically?
I don't really think it will be the same, you know, same kind of closeness as with Philippines. I mean, Philippines and Japan share the geostrategic environment. We're kind of on the other side of the Taiwan island, 111 kilometers on this side or the other side. And so we kind of understand each other very well vis-a-vis what China has been doing recently. And we share the feelings, I think, the fears, the anxiety inside. And that doesn't apply to the Indonesians. So I don't know. Another very close country is Vietnam, but strategically that's a little bit far. But I think in terms of human exchange, Vietnam is also very big in present here. And I really wish if we could treat them much better than we do currently. And because recently they were in a trainee status. Very soon, with this terrible weakening of yen, Japan may lose attractiveness as a kind of a place to earn money for many Southeast Asians. I think we still have lots of advantages like very safe society and Asian culture, food, and so. But it's not going to be quite as the same as the Philippines, I feel. With the Indonesians, also Malaysians. Thai is also very friendly, but then politically, I think in Philippines was really the good partner that we were looking for. For the other Asian countries, I think it'll take a little bit more time. I would bet for Vietnam rather than Indonesia.
Well, we can compare that in a year's time. Development in the two cases. Let's go back. Let me first of all encourage all of the audience, the people listening, to write questions into Q&A as on any subject or anything you like to. I notice one or two people have got kind of a raised hand symbol. If you could, we can't use that in this system of Zoom, but we can take questions in Q&A. So please just put briefly your question, and I'll read it out. But let's go back to the US a bit. I mean, the US economy, stronger than expected, as Jesper said. 15 million jobs created under his watch, obviously helped by not having a pandemic in the latter part of it. But how do you see that, Yoko, playing into the election? Currently, the opinion polls are 50-50 in the US. More or less. It's essentially a dead. But it's April, 6 months to go. Are we going to see the economic factor really coming through in political terms, do you think, in the US? And Biden pulling ahead? It's, the feel-good factor is there.
Wow. You said you're not going to do predictions today, Bill.
Okay, I'm asking you to do predictions. I'm not doing them.
I don't know, but although it applies to many countries, although the economy is good or maybe good, the fruits are not enjoyed equally by all people.
Yes.
That also applies to here in Japan. The stock market going, record high. It for many people it sounds like something happening in a different universe. It has nothing at all to do with their everyday life. I mean, it's true. Our wages have remained very stagnant, and the prices have been going up. You notice that very much. So I assume, a lot of people would be feeling the same in the States. And so therefore it's kind of, you can't directly link how the economy is doing with the election results. I think it's rather different from like in Clinton days where everybody was happy. But nowadays, I think there's so much difference that you can't immediately say good economy would serve in interest of the current government.
No, I absolutely recognize that. Jesper?
No, but what the point Yoko raises is actually very stark in Japan. And this is, remember, Bill, when you asked me at the outset about the economy, this consumer-led economic recovery, I don't think is going to happen here. And that's this, the shunto is good, real wages are going to rise, so consumption will pull its weight. But 1 in 4 Japanese now lives off their pension. And
Yes.
whether the stock market is at 20,000 or 50,000, whether the shunto is at 3% or at 6%, it makes no difference to the monthly pension check that you're actually going to get. And because Japan has this wonderful thing called the macro slide, great invention, it basically means that your pension increases are actually going to lag inflation increases, right? Which is quite interesting. So as a result of that, here for Mr. Kishida, right? Great party, great this, that, all the other in the United States. He's going to come back and his popularity is barely going to move, in my personal opinion. And again, this is, yes, the economy is doing well. Yes, all the macro and cyclical indicators are pointing in the right direction, but a feel-good factor, given that 1 in 4 lives off a pension, is very, very unlikely to be coming through. And by the way, it's very clear that your pension, what do Americans call that, entitlements, your out-of-pocket expense for this, that, or the other. I mean, when you look at the details of the line-by-line items in the budget, your out-of-pocket expense continues to go up when you're a pensioner rather than coming down. And that obviously, is ultimately, Prime Minister Kishida's biggest weakness. In the sense of that if you want to win an election, you got to be popular, right? And he's a lot of things, but popularity is not one of them.
No, absolutely. No number indicates popularity for poor Mr. Kishida. I think that's absolutely right. Now, there's a couple of questions that I think one should make sure I get in. The first, perhaps, is for you, Yoko. Gregory Evans has asked a security question. How concerned are people in Japan over the current situation in the Middle East? Is it seen as a pressing issue or simply one that needs to be left to the United States? Is this a faraway issue as far as Japan is concerned, or is it something that worries a lot of Japanese people?
Well, that's a difficult question. Well, it is this image of Gaza being bombed is on the TV a lot, but does that really show a deeper concern? I'm not so sure. I mean, personally, I'm very much concerned, partly because, and Jesper probably as well, partly because I've lived several years in Europe and especially in Germany, and this Jewish problem really creates a psychological problem for the people there. But for Japanese people, it's really not that kind of emotional problem. I feel that people were much more emotionally involved in Ukrainian case somehow. I guess they felt kind of similarity to the landscape, the people, how the city was built, whereas Middle East feels totally different and very far away and exotic. So, of course, I mean, the energy price is a concern for everyone, and people are worried about escalation all the time. But I think there's a qualitative difference to how Americans or Europeans are worried about this.
I remember just a personal anecdote. I think the first time I went to, maybe this is because of the kind of things I wrote about, but the first time I ever went to a meeting of what was then the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was actually in Tokyo in 1983 or 84, which I was invited, and I thought, well, I'll go because I'd never done that. And in a way, it did. What was interesting about it was that it felt like it was happening. The things that were being talked about were happening in a different universe, to use your phrase from earlier, Yoko. I think that's right. Now, let me bring in two more questions, which are basically very similar questions from Martin Barrow and Stephen Gomersall, both about China. We had a little questioning about Jesper's Kanzler being in China, Olaf Scholz. But what Martin Barrow asks, is there not a need for dialogue with China from a Japanese point of view? And Stephen asks, what is Japanese business currently thinking about China? Perhaps both of you. Maybe start with you, Jesper, about the business side. How is China being viewed currently in the business community?
The answer is very straightforward, is ideally we don't want to choose, because you find that for the Keidanren companies, for listed companies in Japan, basically around 23-24% of their earnings come from exports to or production in the People's Republic of China. An additional 24-25% come from exports to or production in ASEAN, in the rest of Asia. And what you actually find, and you may have seen, there is a wonderful new opinion poll by this institute in Singapore that every year for the last decade, asked the ASEAN member countries and the big companies there, if you had to choose, would you align with America or would you align with China? Yeah. And typically over the last decade, it was always the United States that had a 10-point or so lead over China. But the survey taken earlier this year for the first time shows a flip, with 51% of the ASEAN companies preferring an alliance with China rather than an alliance with the United States. Now, take this with a grain of salt and all of that thing, but I think from a Japanese perspective, certainly the discussions I'm having with CEOs and business leaders here, right, is that yes, in terms of incremental investment, do you build another factory? Do you build another logistics hub in the People's Republic of China? Or do you look towards an alternative in Vietnam, towards an alternative, in Malaysia? The data is very clear. There is a marginal retrenchment of new investment going into the People's Republic of China. But in terms of the ongoing business relationships, right, still very, very strong. And you actually see, when you look at, sort of exchanges of labor being trained, Japanese transplants sending their labor for skilling or reskilling here to Japan and back and forth. This has all started to accelerate very, very sharply, right, over the last 6 months, actually, which is very, very interesting. It was the closing and the dramatic COVID controls that the People's Republic of China had that actually prevented that exchange of people. But now that China has opened up, that the Shanghai lockdown is over, these programs are actually kicking in very, very quickly. You also see record number of Chinese students applying to Japanese graduate schools, right, which is very, very interesting. right? So, the nexus between Japan and the People's Republic of China continues to be a very, very strong one.
Yoko, what's your feeling about particularly that comment about academia, but which you're probably seeing, but secondly about the security dialogue that Japan can have with China? I mean, Japan is building deterrence capabilities vis-a-vis China and North Korea and Russia, but at the same time needs a dialogue. What can it talk about?
Yes, definitely we need a dialogue. I mean, back to the academia, very recently the Economist wrote that China is not really helping the business; it's all doing the wrong things, and it's not been helping the dialogue in academia. Some of the researchers have been detained in China in the past for several months, and it hasn't helped. So many China specialists have think twice, 3 times before they go to China. And if you don't absolutely need it, you don't go to China anymore. If you're in security business, I don't. So it's not helping at all how they have put pressure on us. They're also putting pressure on the business as well from time to time, and I think it's a very foolish thing to do. Apart from that, security-wise, I really agree that we need dialogue, but it will take a long time. China is kind of like Germany in the late 19th century, catching up to be the one of the big ones. And you remember how Wilhelm II wanted to build a navy as big as the British one. And I think kind of China really reminds me of Germany in those days nowadays. They're trying to catch up in terms of ICBMs. And until they do that, they don't feel big enough to be the one of the best in the world. I really don't think, historians have written a lot about Anglo-German naval race and how there was really no intention on the German side to challenge in a military way the British dominance. I wouldn't say that about China. But given the current situation, I'm rather pessimistic that China would open up to dialogues in the near future. However, I think we should keep on trying. I mean, seeing all the military buildups on both sides. And China will have enough ICBMs one day that they feel that they can sit down and talk with us, or the Americans at least. Apart from that, one of my recent projects has been, I mean, several years ago, I was talking about deterrence. I think everybody now talks about deterrence. So now I try to talk about dialogue. The trouble here is that nowadays we have less and less neutrals in this world. It was good that you had Helsinki, you had Sweden, Geneva is still there, but there's nothing much more left here. So when we think about kind of a group dialogue in Asia, I have only 2 candidates. One is obviously Singapore, the other is Mongolia. And so I'm planning to visit Mongolia this autumn probably to find out how they feel about it. I mean, all these countries that are sandwiched by the 2 giants, Russia and China, they don't like it. And they would want a detente. They would want a more relaxed environment. And so do we. But there's a lot of things that has to be done before that. So I think the world still needs a vibrant Japanese and German economy, really, not just American, to buy time until the Chinese and Russians feel like talking again. Yes.
I quite agree, and I would. Let's add to the British economy to that. But also, I will point out that I did look recently at the numbers of big ships in the Japanese and British navies, and well, let's point out that the Maritime Self-Defense Force is twice the size of the British Royal Navy now. So Japan is certainly a significant. Now, Rupert Middle popped in a very interesting question, which we don't really have time to address in great detail, but he's asked, with stronger US-Japan defense ties, what's the scope for the US purchasing Japanese defense equipment and technology? Of course, it's recently been permitted to purchase its own technology in the form of Patriot missiles made in Japan under defense export guidelines. Jesper, final quick comment. Big scope, small scope, long distance scope?
Very small scope. It's America's core competence and core business. They're not going to give it up.
Good answer. Good answer. Well, we'll see if we can find any variants around that, around the outside of that in future conversations. But let me conclude this by thanking very warmly Yoko Iwama from GRIPS for joining us for this very interesting discussion. And as always, my good friend Jesper Koll, and of course all of you for coming along and loyally supporting this Japan Macro Salon. We will see you again in 3 months' time, and we will see what we have learned by then. Thank you very much. Have a great evenings in Tokyo. Have a great afternoon in the UK. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.